All right, here's the last lesson, Unit 8 of the Depression and the New Deal. Let's finish it off and get out of this depression, and let's move on to other things, although they're not so great. Moving to World War II. There's your snap chart. Life during the Depression for minorities and women, Mexican Americans, African Americans as well should be in that question. Here we go. Big idea, main idea here, the Depression really falls hard on minority groups who are already in the lower end of the economic ladder. It gets even more severe for them. Do they get a lot of attention? Are they really involved or not? Let's go and check it out. Some effects overall, just a review of life overall in terms of agricultural America. There are 400,000 farms lost. On a farm, they tend to have a little bit larger family size because you kind of need some of those kids, and kids do a lot of the work on the farm. So let's say there's 6 on average out in rural America, kids in a family. We do the math, and the number of people impacted by this depression is pretty large. But then you got all these small towns out in rural America. Let's say on average you got 5 different types of small business in a town or a community. You got mechanics, you got grocers, you got hardware stores, you got feed stores, different types of businesses, clothing stores, that kind of thing. And let's say they've got 4 people on average in their family. And you do the math there, and you've got 48 million different people heavily impacted just in the agricultural rural American community to begin with, right? So this is very significant. And what you see here in the picture is basically a foreclosure auction on a person's farm. They sell everything, pails, forks, whatever they can to get as much money out of that farm to repay that loan and recoup as much losses as the bank can. It's usually not everything for sure. Runs on banks foreclosing in large numbers. We talked about that before. There really is a psychological depression here. Suicide skyrockets. The old and the elderly are especially very much impacted here as well. Keep in mind, up until now, there is no TGIF. It's Friday at all, but there will be with some of these new programs a limitation on work, and that will affect things in how we live in the after decades coming up. Skyrocketing homelessness, people just trying to make a home out of something, anything, anywhere. People roaming the countryside trying to find work. Our hobo culture, which it was called at the time, not so PC today, develops. People jumping on trains, riding trains to the next stop, walking from one place to one town to the next to try and find a job, living in trailers of all types that are just made out of anything they could possibly find. The most important thing people really had, if you had one, was your car. You tried to hang on to that car as long as you can because it was your home, all your possessions are there, it was your opportunity to get to the next spot. Unemployment, there are the numbers in 1934 alone. It's worse in cities. Some of the significant stress is heavy in urban areas because, again, they can't support themselves on land and basically grow a garden or a crop of any type anywhere. Families really break apart and are split apart significantly during this time period. Husbands leave their wives, so on and so forth. In increasing numbers here, I can't take care of them, you're better off on your own, kind of a mentality thing. Large amounts of separations and broken families and divorces and such. Pictures, images of schools in rural America. Rural America has some severe poverty as well. That's going to be addressed. We talked about soup lines in the nation's cities being set up. Some were state-run and community-run, but there wasn't a lot of money for that. When the Depression comes, New Deal comes around, there'll be some more funding for that. But people digging in garbage, raiding gardens, things like that. Were very common, of course, incidents of stealing and things of that also as well. Food lines here, soup lines that we talked about before, supported by gangsters like Al Capone, made him a hero. Hard times in America. Again, it's difficult. Not everybody loses their job. Not everybody's needed relief. Most Americans just did with less. Heaviest suffering is in urban cities or with farmers in bankruptcy. If you were able to keep your farm, if you had some land, you grew up a garden, you kind of did things that way to do what you can to feed yourself on your own. But there is a lot of stress from town to town where people are roaming into from one community to another and looking for a job, and those that are in that particular community look at these outsiders and say, get out of here, there's no kind of job here, just leave. And so there is some real stress that way. But families pull together by consolidating themselves, extended families, all of a sudden living under one household and living together. Women, if they were single, quite often they became single because their husbands left them, or if you had a house, You would work out in somebody else's house, do their laundry, taking all these odd jobs to do things. You would make your own clothes, you'd bake your own bread. Canning jars here would go up significantly at this point in time. Make your own, do your own kind of thing really became a much stronger thing here. People would rent out their homes and rooms to people and become basically like little motels for people passing through or in a particular community. Types of glass, consumer goods that were bought and sold would change too significantly. You could buy glass items, but they were cheaper. Things called depression glass were a lower grade of glass that people were able to buy because they had less money. So what was produced for consumer goods changed and was modified to meet people's ability to pay. Again, women in the time period, whenever there's extreme stress, disaster, it seems like there are opportunities and good things that come out of it. FDR's cabinet, was mentioned before, all of a sudden has the first woman in it, Frances Perkins, to increase diversity there. He does appoint 100 plus women to different public positions in government. Cataway of Arkansas is the first woman senator in 1932, and of course Eleanor Roosevelt, significant in collecting information and giving feedback to FDR on the needs of the country. Native Americans put a big star on this. This is significant because there's a change here from what had previously happened in the 1880s. There is a new head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and a new policy in the Bureau of Indian Affairs that was created a few decades prior. There are reforms in how Native Americans are treated and support for them. It's the Indian New Deal. The sale of reservation land is going to stop. About 77,000 Native Americans are going to get jobs within organizations and New Deal programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, which you're working on in your matrix. There is, in the Public Works Administration, some funds for new schools on the reservations. But the most important thing here is the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934 that's passed. It basically reverses a previous law passed by Congress, restoring more oversight and sovereignty, power over their lives to Native Americans. Traditional tribal governments are allowed to be set up here on reservation land. They start giving money for land purchase to basically purchase back some of the land that was sold off under the previous act I'm going to review here in a minute, allowing those reservations to be enlarged. And what this really does is it reverses the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. If you remember, that particular act required Native Americans to basically have their own personal piece of land, like white society and white civilization would, and they would become a farmer on it, and if they were a farmer, they would, on it for X number of years, they'd become a citizen. This kind of disbanded that and reverses that whole thing. So know that particular piece of legislation. For Hispanic Americans, there are many migrant workers and farmers from Mexico that have been in the United States before, but as the Depression deepened, resentment grows, and there's a big push by unions and by Americans to drive them out, go back to your homeland, we don't need you here, you're taking up our jobs, that kind of thing. Often this is done by government force. We'll see this pattern a couple of times. There's also, in terms of violence in the Deep South and through other parts of the nation, the lynching we talked about before, it's still going on. With economic stress, there is more violence, as we mentioned, but the efforts for civil rights and civil liberties, it's important to note, do not happen here. The Depression, the New Deal is really about economic reform. There's no political reform here. African Americans, though they are voting more for the Democratic Party than ever before, they're basically abandoning the Republican Party. They're not getting an anti-lynching law and any particular protections here politically, and especially when FDR, or if FDR as a Democrat were to promote the idea of an anti-lynching law that Ida B. Wells and others have been pushing for quite a while, would the South support the New Deal programs? Solid Democratic South would probably say no. FDR wouldn't get his New Deal programs to reform and revise the economy. So circle that on your notes. So it's all about what's possible and politically possible and able to be done right now, and who's willing to support what to get out of the Depression. Again, political rights, civil liberties, kind of put on hold, to say the least. for minorities in the world of agriculture. And we know that African Americans in the South are still doing a significant amount of sharecropping. They're also tenant farmers, things like that. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, when you complete that on your matrix, understand and know that this gives a subsidy. That's a very important word to know. Circle that. It's basically a cash handout by the government to farmers to not plant crops, to decrease the supply of what they're producing, and if the supply goes down, the price goes up. But for a non-landowner, like sharecroppers here in the South and other white non-landowners as well, that is not so good. The subsidy is going to the white farmer. The white farmer says, well, I'm not interested in having you grow anything on my cropland because the government is giving me money not to plant crops, so therefore, I'm sorry, you're a little bit of a tough situation. I don't need you. Go find somewhere else to grow your crop and share crop for somebody else. And so the Agricultural Adjustment Act and that piece of New Deal legislation wasn't so great for them. There is a program, though, and this was under the WPA program called the Federal Writers Project. There are a good number of artists and writers that get government programming funding here and jobs here. And in this particular project, there were interviews and oral histories recorded on tape of the life of former slaves. And so what we know about slavery is significantly expanded because of the Great Depression and the New Deal program called the Federal Writers Project. We don't know, wouldn't know as much as we do otherwise without that. Some political gains in terms of connection to, involvement, seeking input from minorities and African Americans from government officials happens here, as we kind of talked about before. Roosevelt does have a black cabinet, which he has multiple people from the African American community, college professors and such, giving them information about what they need and how the New Deal could possibly help African Americans. The migration is significantly still moving here with economic stress. Sharecroppers, as we talked about before, maybe not having as much opportunity in the South, looking for jobs in the cities. However, that creates some stress because everybody's looking for a job, and maybe we don't want you here. A big name here is this Mary McLeod Bethune, who is also on his black cabinet for FDR. She's a founder of the Daytona Education Industrial Training School for Negro girls. This is one of those Florida questions that might pop up for you on the EOC. She's in the FDR's black cabinet, as I mentioned. She also establishes, which is still around here today, FDR's the Bethune-Cookman College in Daytona, Florida. She's the first African-American woman to lead and organize a federal agency, and the agency she ran was the National Youth Administration. That's in your matrix as well. Note a couple other things that it did. So as we have this economic stress, radical ideas and radical groups and organizations pop up and do gain some influence in the United States. The Socialist Party is around, as we talked about before, Industrial Revolution, late 1800s, early 1900s. The Communist Party is around as well. Basically, they're saying capitalism has failed. The Nazi Party, as you see here, a march of the Nazi Party organization in Chicago in the 1930s was around as well. And throughout the United States, especially throughout the North, where there's heavy German populations, there was kind of a propaganda program from Nazi Germany, from Hitler and the Nazis, to promote and set up these what they call Bund, American Bund associations, and they would have these meetings and gatherings celebrating everything German and kind of perpetuate that whole German Nazi kind of a thing. And there are these massive rallies, as you see here in New York City, for example, and they kind of talked about George Washington being the first American Nazi and that kind of thing. And so the radical elements of Europe that we're familiar with are really trying to spread their ideology in the United States and America as well. In terms of entertainment and the arts, they are big in the 1930s. The trend is, let's go to the movies so we can escape the depression, escape the difficult times. The themes that were created and the types of movies and films and such that were created were light, they were romantic, happy, things that were surreal, escapism. The Wizard of Oz we talked about before, written in 1900, that kind of highlighted the populist movement and the failures of the populist movement. The plight of the common people was a big one at the time. Again, it's all about helping people forget about their problems. So actually the numbers of people going to films and movies really went up. So coping with hard times, this is one of the ways in which they did it. Radio, big just like the 1920s, became bigger. Soap operas develop, and they're called soap operas because in between, in the intermission periods, they would have these laundry detergent ads, adventure programs, variety shows, comedy shows and comedy skits and routines. The Marx brothers were the big ones of that time period, the Groucho and Marco Marx, the Bad Marksman. At the movies also, there's some other big films. This will come out actually at the end of the Depression, the film with the Grapes of Wrath in 1940. But people are going to go in the numbers of about 85 million every single week. The first child star, Shirley Temple, she just died here in 2016 or 2017, was big at the time as well. A lot of what was portrayed, again, is all about escapism, fantasy, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Gone with the Wind in 1939, and of course, as I mentioned before, The Wizard of Oz. Writers and painters, literaries were more focused on just the realities and the difficulties of life. John Steinbeck is the biggest one with The Grapes of Wrath, focusing on farmers in rural America and tenant farmers, sharecroppers out in rural America and the Great Plains. We'll take a look at that film that is created out of that in a little bit, and what is behind all of that. Photographers, especially Dorothy Lange, significant at this point in time. She really kind of becomes the photographer that breaks down a lot of barriers for women and kind of creates a professional set of a piece of work and her life's work that shows what a photographer can do by documenting life at the time. And so she, in her pictures, as well as many others, paints this portrait of what life really looks like, the consequences of depression, especially out in rural America. Really one of the first documentary photographers out there at that point in time, and she worked for the Farm Security Administration, part of a New Deal program. And so the New Deal gave some job opportunities again for writers and painters and photographers, for example. Here, remember Dorothy Lange, she's big. The 30s are also known as the Dirty 30s because of this great Dust Bowl that happens. And the Dust Bowl, I would put a star by this also. Good possibility something like this comes up with kind of an environmental theme and the impact of things that happened in World War I and previous westward expansion, the Homestead Act, out into an arid part of the United States that, if you remember, wasn't heavily settled right away. It was actually the interior here that was the last really heavily settled and place to be settled in that Western Manifest Destiny time period after the Civil War. But this is going to be the site of the largest human-related natural disaster in U.S. history. And this is highlighted, and life is highlighted also by this guy by the name of Woody Guthrie, who is a social singer-songwriter. Bob Dylan is going to be heavily influenced by him, and if you listen to their music, they sound very much similar and the same, but they really sing about the common man. And one of his famous songs was the Dust Pneumonia Blues, and people would literally get dust pneumonia from these dust storms that would develop because of this massive drought and this Dust Bowl. The areas in the states hardest hit, as you saw on the map, are Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, New Mexico, so on and so forth. These particular places we're seeing large numbers of farmers losing their farms because they couldn't grow anything anymore. It just stopped raining. They rented from somebody else. They were basically evicted off of that land. We've got thousands of people moving west to California, migrant workers looking for other types of farm, migrant, pick crops, pick oranges kind of jobs. Things like that. And the people that were moving in that direction kind of became known as Okies in reference to Oklahoma. Why did the Dust Bowl occur? One, it's about poor farming practices from the east. If you draw a line right about here, from about New Orleans out to the eastern edge of the Dakotas, this 100th meridian is the dividing line where you have a significant amount of rainfall and the soil is pretty heavy, and the farming practices are pretty much consistent from north to south, but on the other side it's more arid. It's not a desert, but it is arid. It's heavy grassland. It wasn't turned into farmland until we got some technology to actually be able to till up the land and the soil, and we started using some different farming practices like dry soil farming, which is planting the seed a little bit deeper into the soil, closer to the moisture. It's those practices that didn't really work out here. When they were tilling up the soil, they didn't really realize that it's the roots that were of the intense grasses and the prairie grasses that were out there that was holding this soil down. And when all of a sudden it starts drying up and we get into a cycle of very little rain, all of a sudden this loose soil, which was tilled up very heavily during World War II, remember, wheat will win the war, plant more, grow more, the farmers surely did. And before that, the Homestead Act and farmers coming out into the prairies to set up farms out there before that as well, results in this large amount of farmers being out there trying to till up soil that has no moisture, that gets blown away, and as it gets hotter in a drought, the winds blow stronger and it blows in the Great Plains anyway. And they were just continuing to keep trying to plow this stuff up. What else does a farmer do, right? And so it's tractors, it's disc plows that turned up more of this soil than any other time in history. It wasn't really supposed to be farmed in this way. So that on top of the severe drought and then the strong prairie winds just results in huge amounts of soil being kicked out to other parts of the country. Actually, it blows all the way to Washington, D.C. and onto ships out in the west. We'll watch a video clip that kind of highlights that a little bit more. Big important thing, human interaction with the environment. What can humans do to destroy it? There's a good example. There's your snap chart if you want to look at chapter 24, lesson 3, and that page in the American Journey textbook. You can review this and go ahead and bullet some information about how things look for African Americans and Native Americans, and you're good to go. Good day.